The moment Jake Morrison collapsed to his knees in the school courtyard, gasping for air, while three older boys stood over him laughing, his inhaler glinting in the sunlight just out of reach in Derek Sullivan's hand, nobody expected what would happen next. Certainly not the 100 students eating lunch nearby, definitely not the teachers monitoring from the windows, and absolutely not Derek Sullivan himself, who thought grabbing an asthmatic kid's inhaler was just another Tuesday prank. What none of them knew was that Jake's sister Maya had been watching from across the courtyard, and Maya Morrison was not. The type of girl you wanted to mess with when it came to her little brother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Morrison family had arrived in Riverside 3 weeks earlier. On a grey October morning, their moving truck barely fitting down the narrow streets of their new neighborhood. For Maya Morrison, 17 and a senior, this was her 4th school in 6 years. Military families moved often, but her father's recent medical discharge from the army had finally brought them to what he promised would be their permanent home. Maya had heard that promise before, but this time felt different. This time, her father's limp from the IED explosion in Afghanistan was a constant reminder that some changes were forever. Jake Morrison, 15 and small for his age, had taken the news of another move harder than anyone expected. At their last base in Colorado, he'd finally found his place on the robotics team, made real friends who didn't care that he needed an inhaler or that his voice still cracked when he got excited about coding. Now, walking through the halls of Riverside High School with his schedule clutched in his sweaty palm, he felt like he was starting over for the 100th time. Maya watched her brother disappear into the crowded hallway that first morning, noting how his shoulders hunched forward defensively, how he kept his head down to avoid eye contact. She recognized the posture because she'd worn it herself at enough new schools. The difference was that Maya had learned to straighten her spine, lift her chin, and stare down anyone who looked at her sideways. Jake hadn't figured that out yet. Riverside High School sat in the heart of a town that had seen better days. Once thriving on manufacturing jobs, the community now struggled with unemployment and the social tensions that came with economic uncertainty. The school building itself was old, but well maintained, its brick facade and long corridors creating an institutional atmosphere that could feel either welcoming or oppressive, depending on your perspective. For students like Derek Sullivan, whose grandfather had been mayor and whose father owned the largest remaining factory in town, the school was their kingdom. For newcomers like the Morrison siblings, it was territory to be navigated carefully. Maya's first period was advanced placement literature with Mrs. Chen, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who had been teaching at Riverside for over 20 years. The classroom was arranged in a circle, encouraging discussion, and Maya immediately appreciated that this teacher expected students to think critically rather than just memorize facts. When Mrs. Chen asked the class to introduce themselves and share a book that had influenced them, Maya chose The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. "It helped me understand what my father went through overseas," Maya said simply, not elaborating on the nightmares that still woke him some nights or the way he sometimes stared off into nothing during dinner. It's about carrying burdens, visible and invisible ones. The response from her classmates was mixed. Some nodded with understanding, particularly Emma Rodriguez, whose older brother had served 2 tours in Iraq before coming home changed. Others looked uncomfortable, unused to such personal sharing on a first meeting. But Maya caught the subtle eye roll from Brittany Walsh, a blonde girl in the front row who seemed to be performing her disinterest for an audience. "How profound," Brittany muttered, just loud enough for nearby students to hear. "Another military brat with daddy issues." Maya's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She'd learned that responding to every provocation on day one was a waste of energy. Better to observe, to understand the social landscape before deciding which battles were worth fighting. But she filed away Brittany's name and attitude for future reference. During lunch, Maya found Jake sitting alone in the cafeteria, picking at a sandwich while reading a programming manual. She slid into the seat across from him, noting the way his eyes darted around the room nervously. "How's it going, genius?" she asked, using the nickname that had started as teasing but become genuine affection over the years. Jake shrugged, not looking up from his book. "Same as always, new place, same problems. Anyone giving you trouble?" "Not yet," Jake said, but something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. Just the usual stuff. Kids asking why I carry an inhaler, where I'm from, why we moved so much, nothing I can't handle. Maya studied her brother's face, recognizing the careful neutrality he wore when he was trying not to worry her. Jake had always been protective of her feelings, even when he was the one who needed protecting. It was a trait that made her both proud and frustrated, especially when she could see he was struggling. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" she said gently. Jake finally looked up, his brown eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I know. But Maya, you can't fight all my battles for me. I'm in high school now. I need to figure some things out on my own." The words stung because they were true. Maya had been running interference for Jake since elementary school, when kids first started picking on him for being small, for being smart, for needing medication. She'd perfected the art of subtle intimidation, of making bullies understand that messing with Jake Morrison meant dealing with his older sister. But Jake was right. He needed to build his own strength, find his own voice. The problem was that Maya wasn't sure he had time to figure it out gradually. The social hierarchy at Riverside High School was clearly defined and ruthlessly maintained. At the top sat the athletes, particularly the football and basketball players who brought glory to the school's struggling reputation. Derek Sullivan was the undisputed king of this hierarchy, a senior linebacker with college scouts already sniffing around his potential. Standing 6 feet 4 inches with the kind of easy confidence that came from never being told no, Derek commanded respect through a combination of athletic ability, family influence, and casual cruelty. Derek's inner circle included Marcus Thompson, a running back whose loyalty was bought with Derek's protection from academic consequences, and Tony Ricci, whose father ran the local auto shop and whose mean streak was legendary among underclassmen. Together, they formed a triangle of power that controlled everything from lunch table assignments to party invitations to who got harassed in the hallways. The targets of their attention were predictable. Smart kids who made them feel insecure about their own intelligence. Quiet kids who seemed like easy prey. Different kids who didn't fit the narrow mold of what they considered normal. Jake Morrison, with his slight build, obvious intelligence, and medical needs, checked all 3 boxes. The first incident happened during Jake's second week at Riverside. He was walking to his locker after chemistry class, inhaler in one hand, and a notebook full of equations in the other, when Derek and Marcus appeared beside him like predators materializing from shadows. "Hey, new kid," Derek said, his voice friendly enough that a teacher overhearing might not catch the underlying menace. "Heard you're some kind of computer genius." Jake glanced up, immediately recognizing danger but unsure how to navigate it. "I just like programming," he said carefully. "That's cool," Marcus chimed in, moving to Jake's other side so he was flanked. "Maybe you could help us with something. See, we've got this English paper due tomorrow and we're thinking you might be just the guy to write it for us." The request was phrased politely, but Jake understood it wasn't really a request. He'd been through this routine before, at other schools, with other bullies. The smart kid who wouldn't fight back was always expected to provide academic services in exchange for being left alone. The problem was that the arrangement never stayed fair for long. "I don't think that would be right," Jake said, trying to keep walking toward his locker. "You should probably write your own papers." Derek's hand shot out, not grabbing Jake, but placing itself firmly on his chest, stopping his forward momentum. To anyone watching from a distance, it might have looked like a friendly gesture, but Jake could feel the controlled strength behind it. "See, that's where you're wrong, computer boy," Derek said, his smile never wavering. "What would be wrong is if something happened to that fancy inhaler of yours. Accidents happen all the time around here. Kids lose things, break things. Would be a real shame if you couldn't breathe properly in class." The threat was delivered so casually, with such practiced ease, that Jake realized Derek had done this before, probably many times. The inhaler wasn't just his medication. It was his vulnerability made visible, a target painted on his chest for anyone cruel enough to exploit it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Think about it," Marcus added as they walked away, leaving Jake standing frozen by his locker. "We're not unreasonable guys, just looking for a little academic cooperation from our new friend." Jake spent the rest of the day in a fog of anxiety, barely hearing his teachers, jumping at every unexpected sound. By the time he met Maya at their usual spot for the walk home, his hands were shaking slightly, and his breathing was more labored than usual. Maya noticed immediately. "What happened?" "Nothing," Jake said automatically, then caught himself. "I mean, nothing I can't handle, just some guys being guys." "What guys? What did they do?" Jake hesitated, knowing that telling Maya would mean losing control of the situation entirely. His sister had a protective streak that bordered on the legendary, and while he appreciated it, he also knew it often made things worse in the long run. "Just some seniors asking me to help with homework," he said, which was technically true, even if it omitted the crucial context of coercion and threats. Maya studied his face, clearly not buying the sanitized version, but also recognizing his need to maintain some autonomy. "Okay," she said finally. "But Jake, if these guys cross a line, if they threaten you or hurt you, I need to know. Promise me." "I promise," Jake said, meaning it in the moment, but already knowing he'd probably break that promise if it meant protecting Maya from making a bad situation worse. The next day brought Jake's first real test. During lunch, Derek appeared at his table with a printed essay in his hand and that same dangerously friendly smile. "Computer boy," Derek said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Got that English paper we talked about?" Jake's stomach clenched. He'd spent the previous evening agonizing over what to do, ultimately deciding he couldn't compromise his integrity by cheating, even under threat. "I can't do your homework for you," he said quietly. "It's not right." Derek's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "That's disappointing," he said. "Really disappointing. See, I was hoping we could be friends, Jake. I was hoping you'd be smart enough to understand how things work around here." "I understand," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I can't do it." Derek leaned forward, lowering his voice to a whisper that wouldn't carry to nearby tables. "Here's what's going to happen, computer boy. You're going to reconsider that position. You're going to think real hard about whether your principles are worth what's going to happen if you keep being stubborn. Because I promise you, things can get very unpleasant for kids who don't know how to cooperate." With that, Derek stood and walked away, leaving Jake alone with his untouched lunch and a growing sense of dread. He glanced around the cafeteria, wondering if anyone had witnessed the exchange, but everyone seemed absorbed in their own conversations. He was alone in this, just like always. The escalation began the next morning. Jake arrived at his locker. To find it had been filled with shredded paper, the remnants of what looked like his programming notes from the previous day. Someone had gotten into his locker and destroyed hours of work. There was no note, no signature, but Jake knew exactly who was responsible. During second period, His backpack went missing from the classroom while he was giving a presentation on algorithmic thinking. When he found it after class, it was in the hallway trash can, covered in what appeared to be chocolate milk, but smelled much worse. His textbooks were sticky, his notebooks were ruined, and his spare inhaler was missing entirely. The pattern continued throughout the week. His gym clothes disappeared and were found in the parking lot, run over by cars. His homework assignments vanished from his desk between classes. Someone put super glue in the lock of his locker, forcing him to get a new one from the office. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed as teenage pranks, but together they formed a campaign of psychological warfare designed to wear him down. Maya noticed the changes in her brother immediately. Jake became quieter at dinner, more withdrawn during their walks home. His schoolwork, usually pristine, started showing signs of stress and distraction. When she asked about it, he gave her the same answers about adjusting to a new school and typical teenage drama. But Maya Morrison hadn't survived 4 different high schools by being naive about bullying tactics. She recognized the signs because she'd seen them before in herself and others. The way Jake clutched his backpack tighter in the hallways, the way he timed his bathroom breaks to avoid crowded periods, the way he ate lunch faster, as if he was afraid someone might interrupt him. She started paying closer attention during the school day, positioning herself where she could observe Jake's movements without being obvious about it. That's how she first spotted Derek Sullivan and his friends, how she began to understand the dynamics at play. Maya watched Derek operate. For several days, noting his methods and patterns, the boy was skilled at harassment, she had to admit. He knew exactly how to walk the line between bullying and behavior that could be explained away to adults. He surrounded himself with witnesses who were either loyal followers or too intimidated to speak up. He chose moments when teachers weren't watching, spaces where cameras didn't reach, words that could be interpreted multiple ways. But Maya also noticed his weaknesses. Derek was overconfident, used to getting his way without serious resistance. He relied heavily on his reputation and family connections to protect him from consequences. Most importantly, he clearly didn't expect anyone to fight back, especially not someone like Jake, who seemed so obviously outmatched. The confrontation that would change everything began on a Tuesday morning in late October. Jake was having a bad day already. His inhaler had been acting up, delivering medication inconsistently, and he'd scheduled an appointment with his doctor for after school. The stress of the ongoing harassment had been affecting his asthma, creating a vicious cycle where anxiety triggered breathing problems, which triggered more anxiety. During third period, Jake excused himself to go to the nurse's office for a breathing treatment. It was something he'd done countless times at previous schools, a routine accommodation that was both medically necessary and profoundly embarrassing for a 15-year-old boy who just wanted to blend in. Derek must have been watching for such an opportunity. As Jake walked down the empty hallway toward the nurse's office, Derek and Marcus emerged from a bathroom, blocking his path. "Well, well," Derek said, his voice echoing in the empty corridor. "Computer boys having breathing problems. That's what happens when you don't know how to cooperate, isn't it?" Jake tried to step around them, but Marcus moved to cut off his escape route. "We're talking to you," Marcus said. "It's rude to walk away when someone's talking to you." "I need to get to the nurse," Jake said, his voice already showing signs of strain. "I'm having trouble breathing." Derek's eyes lit up with a cruel kind of interest. "Trouble breathing? That sounds serious. Maybe you need your medicine." He held out his hand in a gesture that appeared helpful, but felt anything but. "Let me see that inhaler. Maybe I can help." Jake instinctively stepped back, clutching his inhaler protectively. "I'm fine. I just need to get to the nurse." No, Derek said, his voice taking on a mocking tone of concern. "I insist. As a fellow student, I want to make sure you're okay. Hand over the inhaler." The demand was clear now, stripped of any pretense of helpfulness. Jake found himself in an impossible situation. He needed his medication, but he also knew that giving Derek control over it would be disastrous. His breathing was becoming more labored, and the stress of the confrontation was making everything worse. "Please," Jake said, hating how weak his voice sounded. "Just let me go to the nurse." Derek stepped closer, invading Jake's personal space in a way that made the smaller boy's anxiety spike even higher. "Here's the thing, computer boy. You've been very uncooperative lately. Very disrespectful. Maybe a little difficulty breathing. We'll help you remember your manners." Before Jake could react, Derek's hand shot out and grabbed the inhaler from his grip. Jake lunged forward to get it back, but Marcus caught his arm, holding him in place while Derek examined the small blue device with exaggerated interest. "Interesting little gadget," Derek said, shaking the inhaler like a maraca. "Seems pretty. Important to you, probably expensive too. Would be a real shame if something happened to it." Jake's breathing was becoming increasingly desperate now, his chest tightening with each labored breath. The combination of his medical condition and sheer panic was creating a dangerous spiral that Derek seemed to find entertaining rather than concerning. "Give it back," Jake gasped. "Please, I can't breathe." Derek held the inhaler just out of reach, like a pet owner teasing a dog with a treat. "Say please like you mean it. Say please, Derek, I'm sorry for being disrespectful." "Please," Jake whispered, his pride crumbling under the weight of his medical need. "Please, Derek, I'm sorry for being disrespectful." Derek's smile widened. "That's better. But you know what? I think you need to learn a real lesson here. I think you need to understand what happens to kids who don't know their place." With that, Derek tossed the inhaler to Marcus, who caught it with a grin. "Keep away," Marcus suggested, and Derek nodded approvingly. What followed was a nightmare that would haunt Jake for months afterward, as his breathing became more and more labored. As his chest tightened and his vision started to blur around the edges, Derek and Marcus played a casual game of catch with his life-saving medication. They tossed it back and forth over his head, just out of reach, laughing at his increasingly desperate attempts to retrieve it. "Jump higher, computer boy," Derek taunted. "Come on, show us how badly you want it." Jake tried to jump, to grab, to plead, but his body was failing him. His legs felt weak, his chest burned, and each breath was a struggle that left him lightheaded. He was going into a full asthma attack, triggered by stress and sustained by the cruel game being played with his medication. It was during this moment of escalating crisis that the bell rang for lunch, and students began flooding into the hallways. Among them was Maya Morrison, who had been looking for her brother to check on him after noticing his absence from their usual meeting spot. Maya turned the corner and saw her little brother on his knees in the hallway, gasping for air while two older boys stood over him laughing. One of them was holding Jake's inhaler, tossing it from hand to hand like a toy. The scene was so shocking, so brazenly cruel, that for a moment Maya couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Then recognition hit her like a physical blow. Her brother, her brilliant, gentle little brother who had never hurt anyone in his life, was being tortured by these boys. They were literally playing games with his ability to breathe, finding entertainment in his medical emergency. Something fundamental shifted in Maya Morrison in that moment. All the careful restraint she'd been exercising, all the strategic patience she'd been counseling herself to maintain, evaporated in an instant. This wasn't about school politics or social dynamics or even bullying in the traditional sense. This was about Jake's life, about his safety, about his fundamental right to exist without being terrorized. Maya had been raised by a father who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, who'd taught her that sometimes violence was the only language bullies understood. She'd been trained in self-defense since she was 12, not because her father expected her to fight, but because he wanted. her to know she could if she had to. Looking at her brother struggling to breathe while his tormentors laughed, Maya knew this was one of those times. The hallway was filling with students now, lunch crowds gathering to see what was happening. Some pointed and whispered, others pulled out phones to record, but none of them intervened. None of them stepped forward to help a boy who was clearly in medical distress. They watched like it was entertainment, like Jake's suffering was just another piece of school drama to be consumed and shared. Maya pushed through the crowd, her vision tunneling until she could see nothing but Derek Sullivan holding her brother's inhaler. The boy was still laughing, still playing his cruel game, completely unaware that his world was about to change forever. Derek finally noticed her approach when she was about 10 feet away. He looked her up and down dismissively, taking in her average height and slender build, clearly not impressed by what he saw. "Hey there, sweetie," Derek said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Looking for someone?" Maya didn't respond immediately. She was too busy assessing the tactical situation, noting Derek's stance, Marcus's position, Jake's condition. Her brother was in serious medical distress, his breathing shallow and rapid, his lips starting to show a blue tint that indicated oxygen deprivation. This was beyond bullying now. This was a medical emergency being caused and sustained by deliberate cruelty. "That's my brother," Maya said finally, her voice calm and level, despite the rage burning in her chest. "And you're going to give him his inhaler right now?" Derek's smile widened. "Your brother? Well, isn't that sweet? Family reunion." He held up the inhaler, shaking it again. "You mean this little thing? We're just helping him learn some manners. Kid's been very disrespectful lately." Maya took another step closer, close enough now that Derek could see her eyes clearly. What he saw there should have warned him, should have made him reconsider his position. Maya Morrison's eyes held the kind of cold fury that came from watching. Someone hurt the person you loved most in the world. "Last chance," Maya said, her voice still eerily calm. "Give him the inhaler." Derek laughed, actually laughed, as if the idea of being threatened by a teenage girl was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. "Or what, princess? You going to tell your daddy? Write a mean letter to the principal?" That's when Derek made his fatal mistake. Instead of simply refusing, instead of walking away or escalating verbally, he decided to demonstrate his power over the Morrison family by dropping Jake's inhaler on the floor and stepping on it. Not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to make his point clear. Hard enough to show everyone watching that Derek Sullivan could do whatever he wanted to, whomever he wanted, and there would be no consequences. The crowd around them had grown larger now, forming a loose circle around. The confrontation. Students held up phones, recording what they expected to be either a humiliating retreat by Maya or an amusing escalation of Derek's dominance. What none of them expected was what actually happened next. Maya Morrison moved faster than anyone thought possible. One moment she was standing 3 feet away from Derek, hands at her sides, looking like any other teenage girl. The next moment, Derek Sullivan was on the ground. Maya's knee pressed firmly into his chest, her hand wrapped around his throat with just enough pressure to make breathing difficult, but not dangerous. The inhaler was in her other hand, retrieved in the same fluid motion that had put Derek on his back. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 2 seconds, executed with a precision and speed that spoke of extensive training and absolute commitment. The hallway went dead silent. 100 students who had been chattering and laughing and recording suddenly found themselves witnessing something none of them had expected. Derek Sullivan, the untouchable king of Riverside High School, was flat, on his back with a girl's knee on his chest, looking up at her with a mixture of shock and dawning fear. "Here's how this is going to work," Maya said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hallway. "You're going to apologize to my brother. You're going to promise never to touch him or his medication again. And then You're going to leave us alone for the rest of the year. Do you understand me?" Derek tried to speak, but Maya's hand on his throat made it difficult. He managed to nod, his face red with humiliation and lack of air. "I can't hear you," Maya said, loosening her grip slightly. "I understand," Derek gasped, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar. Maya held his gaze for another long moment, making sure her message was completely clear, then released him and stood up. Derek remained on the ground for several seconds. Whether from shock or genuine inability to move, no one could tell. Maya immediately turned to Jake, who was still struggling to breathe, but watching his sister with a mixture of awe and concern. She handed him his inhaler and helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as he took several deep puffs of his medication. "You okay?" she asked softly, her voice transformed from the cold authority she'd used with Derek to the gentle concern of a worried sister. Jake nodded, still too winded to speak, but already breathing easier as his medication took effect. The blue tint was fading from his lips, and his breathing was becoming less labored. It was only then that Maya became aware of the crowd around them, of the dozens of phones that had recorded the entire incident, of the stunned silence that had fallen over the hallway. She looked up to see Marcus Thompson backing away slowly, clearly having no desire to challenge someone who had just put his leader on the ground so effortlessly. Derek finally struggled to his feet, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. "You have no idea what you just did," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "No idea who you're messing with." Maya looked at him with the kind of calm that came from absolute confidence in her position. "I know exactly who I'm messing with," she said. "A coward who picks on kids with medical conditions. A bully who thinks his daddy's money makes him untouchable. And now I know exactly who you are too." Derek took a step toward her, his hands clenched into fists, but Maya didn't move. She stood perfectly still, one arm still supporting Jake, her eyes never leaving Derek's face. The message was clear. She wasn't afraid of him, wasn't intimidated by his size or reputation or family connections. If he wanted to escalate this, she was ready. But Derek wasn't stupid, despite his many character flaws. He could see the confidence in Maya's stance, could remember how quickly and efficiently she'd put him on the ground. More importantly, he could see the phones still recording, could imagine the videos already being uploaded to social media. Whatever happened next would be witnessed and documented by dozens of people. Instead of advancing, Derek settled for threats. "This isn't over," he said, pointing at both Morrison siblings. "You think you're tough? You think you can just attack people? We'll see how tough you are when the police get involved, when the school board hears about this, when my father finds out what happened here." Maya smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Please do call the police," she said. "I'd love to explain to them how you were torturing a boy with asthma by withholding his medication. I'm sure they'll be very interested in that story." Derek's face went pale as he realized the implications of what she was saying. A crowd of witnesses had watched him deliberately provoke Jake's asthma attack, had seen him playing keep away with life-saving medication. Whatever story he tried to tell about being attacked would have to account for those facts. The standoff was broken by the arrival of Mr. Patterson, the assistant principal, who had been alerted by a teacher that there was some kind of altercation in the hallway. He pushed through the crowd of students, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd been dealing with teenage drama for over a decade. "What's going on here?" Mr. Patterson demanded, looking from Derek to Maya to Jake, who was still catching his breath but looking much better. Multiple voices started talking at once, students eager to share their version of events, but Maya held up a hand, and something in her demeanor commanded attention. "This boy," she said, indicating Derek, "took my brother's inhaler and refused to give it back while my brother was having an asthma attack. I retrieved the medication and helped my brother. That's what happened. Mr. Patterson looked around the crowd, noting the phones, the excited expressions, the way Derek was standing apart from everyone else, with a look of barely controlled rage on his face. "Mr. Sullivan," the assistant principal said, his voice carefully neutral. "Is that an accurate description of events?" Derek's jaw worked silently for a moment as he tried to figure out how to spin the situation to his advantage. But with so many witnesses, with video evidence already spreading, through the school's social media networks, his options were limited. "She attacked me," Derek said finally. "I was just talking to the kid and she jumped me. Ask anyone." Mr. Patterson turned to the crowd. "Did anyone see what happened here?" Voices erupted again, but this time they weren't supporting Derek's version of events. Students who had watched the entire confrontation began speaking up, describing how Derek had taken Jake's inhaler, how Jake had been struggling to breathe, how Maya had only acted after Derek had refused to return the medication. He was playing keep away with it," said Emma Rodriguez, Maya's classmate from AP Literature. "The kid couldn't breathe, and Derek thought it was funny." "I got it on video," added another student, holding up his phone. "Derek took the inhaler first. The girl was just helping her brother." Mr. Patterson listened to several accounts, all of which corroborated Maya's basic story. Derek had initiated the confrontation by taking Jake's inhaler. Jake had been in medical distress. Maya had intervened to retrieve her brother's medication. "Mr. Sullivan," Mr. Patterson said finally, "you'll need to come with me to the office. We need to discuss this incident in detail." Derek's face flushed red. "Are you kidding me? She's the one who attacked me. She put her hands on me. Where I come from, that's called assault." "Where I come from," Maya said quietly. "Interfering with someone's medical treatment is called assault. Taking someone's medication and refusing to return it while they're having a medical emergency is called assault. What I did was self-defense and defense of others." Mr. Patterson held up a hand to forestall further argument. "Everyone involved needs to come to the office. Ms. Morrison, you and your brother as well. We're going to sort this out properly, with parents and statements and everything documented." As the crowd began to disperse, students still buzzing with excitement over what they'd witnessed, Maya helped Jake gather his scattered belongings. Her brother was breathing normally now, the medication having done its job, but she could see the emotional toll of the incident in his shaky hands and pale complexion. "You okay?" she asked again, checking his breathing and looking for any signs of continuing distress. Jake nodded, then looked up at his sister with an expression of mixed gratitude and concern. "Maya, what you did back there, where did you learn to do that?" "Dad's been teaching me self-defense since I was 12, Maya said simply. "He always said the most important thing wasn't learning how to fight, but learning when fighting was necessary. This was necessary." Jake was quiet for a moment, processing what had happened and what it might mean for their future at Riverside High School. "They're going to come after us now," he said finally. "Derek's not going to let this go." Maya looked at her little brother, seeing the worry in his eyes, but also something new, a spark of hope, maybe. A recognition that he wasn't as alone and defenseless as he'd thought. "Let them come," Maya said, her voice carrying the same calm confidence she'd shown during the confrontation. "I'm not going anywhere, Jake, and neither are you. We belong here just as much as Derek Sullivan or anyone else. Maybe it's time people learned that." As they walked toward the principal's office, Maya's mind was already working through the implications of what had just happened. She'd crossed a line today, had used physical force in a way that couldn't be taken back or explained away. There would be consequences, certainly. Derek's family had influence in this town, and they wouldn't take this humiliation lying down. But Maya also knew that sometimes crossing lines was necessary. Sometimes the only way to protect the people you loved was to show bullies that their victims weren't as helpless as they appeared. Sometimes shocking people was exactly what was needed to change a bad situation. Looking at Jake walking beside her, breathing freely and holding his head a little higher than he had that morning, Maya knew she'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, whatever consequences she had to face, her little brother was safe, and sometimes that was all that mattered. The videos of the confrontation were already spreading through Riverside High School's social media networks, shared and reshared with captions that ranged from admiring to incredulous. Maya Morrison, the quiet new girl from AP Literature, had just done something that no one at Riverside High School had ever done before. She'd put Derek Sullivan on his back in front of 100 witnesses, and she'd done it to protect her little brother. The ripple effects of that moment would spread far beyond a single confrontation in a high school hallway, but that's a story for another day. For now, as Maya and Jake Morrison walked toward the principal's office to face whatever consequences awaited them, they walked together. And that, Maya thought, was exactly how it should be. The principal's office at Riverside High School had seen its share of conflicts over the years, but nothing quite like the situation that unfolded that Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Sarah Williams, a woman in her late 50s who had been running the school for 8 years, found herself dealing with a crisis that threatened to explode beyond the school's walls and into the broader community. The first call came from Derek Sullivan's father, before the students had even reached the office. Richard Sullivan's voice boomed through the speakerphone with the kind of authority that came from owning the largest business in town and having the mayor's direct number programmed into his phone. "Sarah, I just got a call from my son saying he was attacked by some new student." Richard's voice carried the expectation of immediate action. "I want that girl expelled immediately. We're talking about assault here, possibly criminal charges. Derek's got witnesses, video evidence, the whole thing." Dr. Williams had learned to navigate the politics of her position carefully, especially when it came to influential families like the Sullivans. But she'd also been an educator long enough to know that there were always multiple sides to every story, and the initial version was rarely the complete truth. "Richard, I understand you're concerned," Dr. Williams replied, keeping her voice professional and calm. "But I need to investigate this properly before making any decisions. I'm going to speak with all the students involved, review any available evidence, and get statements from witnesses. Once I have all the facts, we'll determine the appropriate course of action." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Richard Sullivan spoke again, his tone had shifted to something more dangerous. "Sarah, I hope you understand the position you're in here. The Sullivan family has been supporting this school district for 3 generations. My father was on the school board when you were hired. My grandfather's name is on half the buildings in this town. I'm not asking for special treatment, I'm asking for justice." The unspoken threat hung in the air between them. Dr. Williams understood perfectly well what Richard Sullivan was saying. Cross his family and her job could be in jeopardy. The school board was filled with business leaders who owed their success to Sullivan's factory and the jobs it provided. Going against the Sullivan family was career suicide in a town like Riverside, but Dr. Williams also understood something else. Whatever had happened in that hallway had been recorded by multiple students and was already spreading across social media. The story was bigger than just a school disciplinary issue now. It was becoming a public relations nightmare that could reflect badly on the entire school district if not handled properly. "I appreciate your concern, Richard," Dr. Williams said finally, "and I promise you that this situation will be handled appropriately, but I need to follow proper procedures. I'm sure you understand." The line went dead without a goodbye, leaving Dr. Williams staring at her phone and wondering if she'd just signed her own resignation letter, but there was no turning back now. She had to see this through and hope that the truth, whatever it was, would be compelling enough to protect her from the political fallout that was sure to follow. When Maya and Jake Morrison arrived at the outer office, they found Derek Sullivan already there, sitting in one of the hard plastic chairs with an ice pack pressed to his throat. His father had arrived within minutes of the phone call, a tall man in an expensive suit who looked like an older, more polished version of his son. Richard Sullivan was pacing the small waiting area like a caged predator, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end. Maya noticed the way the office staff treated the Sullivans, the deference in their voices, the way they seemed to anticipate Richard's needs before he voiced them. It was clear that this family was accustomed to being catered to having their problems solved quickly and quietly. She wondered if that was part of the reason Derek had felt so entitled to torment her brother. When you grew up believing that rules didn't apply to you, it was easy to assume that other people's rights didn't matter either. Jake sat beside his sister, still occasionally using his inhaler, but breathing much more easily now. The color had returned to his cheeks, and the frightened, desperate look in his eyes had been replaced by something Maya hadn't seen there in weeks, a quiet confidence. Her brother was still processing what had happened, still coming to terms with the fact that someone had finally stood up for him in a way that made a real difference. The door to Dr. Williams's office opened, and the principal emerged with Mr. Patterson close behind her. Dr. Williams was a short woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked tired, as if she'd aged several years in the past hour, but her expression was determined. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, addressing Derek's father first in a tone that was respectful but not deferential. "I appreciate you coming so quickly. I'd like to speak with Derek first, then with the other students involved. If you could wait here, we'll have everything sorted out shortly." Richard Sullivan stopped pacing and fixed Dr. Williams with a stare that had intimidated countless business rivals over the years. "I want to be present during Derek's interview. As his parent, I have that right." "Actually," Dr. Williams replied calmly, "school policy allows for parental presence during disciplinary hearings, but initial fact-finding interviews are conducted with students only. It helps ensure we get the most accurate account of events without outside influence." The words were polite, but Maya caught the steel underneath them. Dr. Williams might be intimidated by the Sullivan family's influence, but she wasn't going to let them dictate how she ran her investigation. That was encouraging, though Maya suspected the real test would come when the principal had to decide what consequences to impose. Derek was called into the office first, shooting a venomous look at Maya as he passed. She met his gaze steadily, neither challenging nor backing down, simply acknowledging his presence with the kind of calm that suggested she wasn't particularly concerned about what he might say about her. Through the thin walls of the principal's office, fragments of conversation drifted out to the waiting area. Derek's voice raised in indignation as he described being attacked without provocation. Dr. Williams' calmer tones, asking clarifying questions, pressing for details. Mr. Patterson's occasional interjections, his voice carrying the skepticism of someone who dealt with teenage versions of the truth for many years. Jake leaned closer to his sister, keeping his voice low so it wouldn't carry to where Richard Sullivan was still pacing near the window. "Maya, what if they don't believe us? What if Derek's story is more convincing?" Maya considered the question seriously. Derek was a skilled manipulator, someone who'd clearly had practice explaining away his behavior to adults. He came from a family with significant influence in the community, and he understood how to use that influence to his advantage. More concerning, he genuinely seemed to believe that he was the victim in this situation, which would make his performance More convincing than if he was simply lying. The truth has a way of coming out, Maya said finally. And we've got something Derek doesn't have. What's that? Maya nodded toward the waiting area, where several students had gathered despite the late hour. Emma Rodriguez was there, along with 3 other classmates who had witnessed the confrontation. They were talking quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing toward the principal's office with expressions of concern and determination. Witnesses who aren't afraid to tell the truth, Maya said. Derek's used to people being too intimidated to speak up against him. But what happened today changed something. People saw that he's not as untouchable as everyone thought. Richard Sullivan had noticed the gathering students as well, and Maya could see him calculating, trying to figure out how to neutralize their potential testimony. He approached Emma Rodriguez with the kind of practiced charm that had made him successful in business. "Excuse me, young lady," he said, his voice friendly, but with an undertone of authority. "I'm Richard Sullivan, Derek's father. I understand you witnessed what happened today." Emma looked up at him with the kind of wariness that came from growing up in a family that had learned not to trust powerful men with friendly smiles. "Yes, sir, I did." "I'm sure it was very confusing," Richard continued, his tone suggesting understanding and sympathy. "These things happen so fast, and it's easy to misinterpret what you're seeing. Derek tells me he was just trying to help the boy with his medical issue when he was attacked. Sometimes these situations get blown out of proportion." Emma's expression didn't change. "That's not what I saw, Mr. Sullivan. Derek took Jake's inhaler and wouldn't give it back while Jake was having an asthma attack. Maya had to get it back for him." Richard's smile faltered slightly. "Well, I'm sure that's how it appeared to you, but sometimes these misunderstandings—" "It's not a misunderstanding," Emma interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "I recorded the whole thing on my phone. Derek was playing keep away with a kid's medication while the kid couldn't breathe. That's not helping someone, that's hurting them." The temperature in the waiting area seemed to drop several degrees as Richard Sullivan realized that his son's version of events was about to be contradicted by video evidence. His charm evaporated, replaced by the calculating coldness of a man who'd built his fortune by crushing opposition. "I see," Richard said, his voice now carrying a subtle threat. "Well, I hope you'll remember that sharing false information about someone can have serious legal consequences. Defamation, slander, that sort of thing. Especially when it involves the reputation of a good student from a respected family." Emma's face paled slightly, but she didn't back down. "I'm not sharing false information. I'm telling the truth about what I saw." Before Richard could respond, the office door opened, and Derek emerged, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. It was clear from his expression that the interview hadn't gone as well as he'd hoped. Dr. Williams appeared behind him, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes showing the strain of dealing with a complicated situation. "Ms. Morrison," Dr. Williams said, "could I speak with you next, please?" Maya stood and walked into the principal's office, leaving Jake in the waiting area with the growing tension between Richard Sullivan and the student witnesses. The office itself was typical of school administrators everywhere. Institutional furniture, motivational posters, stacks of paperwork, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick. Dr. Williams gestured for Maya to take a seat across from her desk while Mr. Patterson positioned himself near the door. The principal's expression was unreadable as she consulted a notepad filled with handwritten notes from Derek's interview. "Maya, I'm going to ask you to tell me exactly what happened today, in your own words, from the beginning," Dr. Williams said. "Take your time and try to be as detailed as possible." Maya had been preparing for this moment since the confrontation ended, organizing her thoughts and considering how to present the facts in a way that was both truthful and compelling. She understood that her future at Riverside High School and possibly her family's future in the community might depend on how convincing her account was. I was looking for my brother Jake during lunch break because he hadn't shown up at our usual meeting spot, Maya began, her voice calm and measured. When I found him, he was on his knees in the hallway, clearly having an asthma attack. Derek Sullivan and Marcus Thompson were standing over him, and Derek was holding Jake's inhaler, refusing to give it back. Dr. Williams made notes as Maya spoke, occasionally looking up to gauge her expression and body language. Can you describe Jake's condition at that time? He was in severe respiratory distress, Maya said, drawing on medical terminology she'd learned from growing up in a military family where injuries and medical emergencies were taken seriously. His breathing was shallow and rapid. His lips were starting to turn blue, which indicates oxygen deprivation. He was clearly in the middle of a serious asthma attack. And what did you do when you saw this situation? Maya met Dr. Williams' eyes directly. I asked Derek to give Jake his inhaler immediately. When he refused and continued to treat my brother's medical emergency as a game, I retrieved the inhaler and helped Jake use it. Can you describe how you retrieved the inhaler? This was the crucial moment, Maya knew. How she described her actions would determine whether she was seen as a protective sister or a violent aggressor. Derek was holding the inhaler above, his head out of Jake's reach, while my brother was struggling to breathe. I used a defensive technique my father taught me to quickly disable Derek's ability to threaten my brother and recover the medication. Mr. Patterson leaned forward. What kind of defensive technique? A basic wrist control and takedown, Maya replied matter-of-factly. My father is a military veteran who taught me self-defense. The technique I used was designed to neutralize a threat quickly without causing permanent injury. Dr. Williams set down her pen and studied Maya carefully. Maya, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You're saying that Derek was deliberately withholding your brother's inhaler while Jake was having an asthma attack? Yes, ma'am. Derek had taken the inhaler from Jake earlier and was using it to intimidate him. When Jake's breathing became severely compromised, Derek and Marcus thought it was funny. They were playing keep away with medication that Jake needed to breathe. And you felt that physical intervention was necessary? Maya didn't hesitate. Dr. Williams, my brother, has severe asthma. Without his medication, an attack like the one he was having could be life-threatening. Derek wasn't just bullying Jake. He was creating a medical emergency and then preventing treatment. Yes, I felt that immediate intervention was necessary to protect my brother's health and possibly his life. Dr. Williams made more notes, her expression thoughtful. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with both the principal and assistant principal asking detailed questions about the timeline of events, Maya's relationship with Derek prior to the incident, and her training in self-defense techniques. Throughout the questioning, Maya remained calm and consistent in her answers. She acknowledged that she had used physical force against Derek, but she maintained that it was necessary to protect Jake from what amounted to medical abuse. She also made it clear that she had used the minimum force necessary to achieve her goal of recovering the inhaler and helping her brother. When the interview concluded, Dr. Williams asked Maya to wait outside while they spoke with Jake. As Maya returned to the waiting area, she could see that the situation had escalated in her absence. Richard Sullivan was now on his phone again, speaking in urgent tones about lawyers and criminal charges. The student witnesses had been joined by more classmates, creating a small crowd that was making the office staff nervous. Jake's interview was shorter than the others, partly because his account corroborated Maya's version of events, and partly because Dr. Williams could see that the stress of the situation was affecting his breathing again. Jake described the weeks of harassment leading up to the confrontation, Derek's pattern of targeting him specifically, and the frightening experience of having his medication withheld during a medical emergency. When Jake emerged from the office, his face was pale, but determined. He had clearly found the experience of finally telling an adult in authority about Derek's behavior both terrifying and liberating. For weeks, he had carried the burden of the harassment alone, afraid that involving adults would only make things worse. Now at least, the truth was out in the open. Dr. Williams then interviewed several of the student witnesses, including Emma Rodriguez, whose phone video proved to be crucial evidence. The video clearly showed Derek taking Jake's inhaler, Jake's obvious distress as his breathing became labored, and Derek's refusal to return the medication despite Jake's pleas. It also showed Maya's intervention, which appeared swift but controlled, and Derek's quick recovery afterward, suggesting that he hadn't been seriously injured. The video evidence was damning for Derek's version of events, which had portrayed him as an innocent victim of an unprovoked attack. Instead, it showed a pattern of deliberate cruelty that escalated to the point where a student's health was endangered. As the interviews concluded and the evidence was reviewed, Dr. Williams found herself facing a decision that would have far-reaching consequences regardless of which way she chose. On one hand, she had clear evidence that Derek Sullivan had engaged in serious harassment that endangered another student's health. On the other hand, she also had evidence that Maya Morrison had used physical force against Derek. Regardless of her justification, the pressure from Richard Sullivan was intense and unrelenting. He had made it clear that he expected Maya to be expelled and criminal charges to be filed. He had also made veiled threats about the consequences for Dr. Williams' career if she didn't take appropriate action against the girl who had attacked his son. But Dr. Williams also understood that the situation was more complex than Richard Sullivan wanted to acknowledge. The video evidence and witness testimony painted a clear picture of Derek as the aggressor and Maya as someone who had intervened to protect her brother from what amounted to medical abuse. As evening approached and the school building emptied of most students and staff, Dr. Williams made her decision. She called all parties back into her office for what she described as a preliminary determination, with a full disciplinary hearing to follow within the week. After reviewing all available evidence and witness testimony, Dr. Williams began, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. I have determined that this incident began when Derek Sullivan took Jake Morrison's inhaler without permission and refused to return it while Jake was experiencing a medical emergency. Richard Sullivan's face darkened. Now wait just a minute. Dr. Williams held up a hand. Please let me finish. The evidence shows that Derek's actions created a dangerous situation for Jake, who has a documented medical condition. When Maya Morrison intervened to retrieve her brother's medication, she was acting to protect Jake from what could have been a life-threatening situation. She attacked my son, Richard Sullivan exploded. That girl put her hands on Derek. That's assault. Plain and simple. Mr. Sullivan, Dr. Williams replied, her voice remaining calm but firm. Your son was withholding life-saving medication from a student having a medical emergency. In the eyes of the law, that could be considered assault as well. Maya Morrison's actions appear to have been a reasonable response to protect her brother from serious harm. The room erupted in arguments, with Richard Sullivan threatening lawsuits and demanding that Maya be expelled immediately. But Dr. Williams had made her decision, and she stuck to it despite the pressure. Derek would be suspended for 2 weeks, pending a full investigation into his pattern of harassment against Jake Morrison. Maya would receive a 1-day suspension for using physical force, but the school acknowledged that her actions were taken in defense of her brother during a medical emergency. Jake would receive no disciplinary action, as he was clearly the victim in the situation. Richard Sullivan's reaction was explosive and immediate. He accused Dr. Williams of bias, of caving to political correctness, of failing to protect his son from a violent attack. He threatened to have her fired, to sue the school district, to take the case to the media and expose what he called a cover-up of criminal behavior. But as Richard Sullivan raged and threatened, Dr. Williams remained calm. She had reviewed the evidence carefully, consulted with the school district's legal counsel, and made a decision based on the facts of the case rather than political pressure. She was confident that her decision would stand up to scrutiny, especially given the video evidence that clearly showed Derek's behavior. As the Sullivans stormed out of the school, Richard's threats echoing through the empty hallways, Maya and Jake Morrison found themselves in an unexpected position. They had won the first battle, but they both understood that the war was far from over. Walking to their father's car in the parking lot, Jake finally spoke up about what had been bothering him throughout the entire ordeal. "Maya, what happens now? Derek's not going to forgive this. His father is talking about lawsuits and criminal charges. Did we just make everything worse?" Maya considered her brother's question as they approached their father's pickup truck. Staff Sergeant David Morrison was leaning against the vehicle, still wearing his work clothes from his job at the VA hospital. He had arrived as soon as Maya called him, ready to support his children through whatever crisis they were facing. "Dad," Maya said, as they reached the truck, "we need to tell you what happened today." David Morrison listened without interruption as his children recounted the events of the day. His expression remained neutral throughout their account, but Maya could see the familiar signs of controlled anger in the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when Jake described Derek's harassment campaign. When they finished their story, David was quiet for a long moment, processing what he had heard. Finally, he looked at Maya with an expression of mixed pride and concern. "You did what you had to do to protect your brother," he said simply. "But you're right to be concerned about what comes next. The Sullivan family isn't going to let this go quietly. We need to be prepared for whatever they throw at us." As they drove home through the darkening streets of Riverside, Maya stared out the window at the small town that was supposed to be their permanent home. The houses looked peaceful in the evening light, but she knew that behind those windows, phones were ringing and conversations were happening that would determine how the Morrison family would be received in this community. The story of what had happened at Riverside High School was already spreading beyond the school itself. Parents were calling each other, sharing different versions of events. Social media was buzzing with posts and comments from students who had witnessed the confrontation or heard about it secondhand. The video that Emma Rodriguez had recorded was being shared across multiple platforms, viewed by thousands of people who had never heard of Maya Morrison or Derek Sullivan before today. By the time the Morrison family sat down to dinner that evening, the incident had taken on a life of its own. Maya's phone was buzzing constantly with messages from classmates, some supportive, others critical. Jake's breathing had returned to normal, but the emotional toll of the day was evident in his pale complexion and quiet demeanor. David Morrison sat at the head of their small kitchen table, looking at his children with the expression of a man who had faced combat overseas and understood that sometimes conflict was unavoidable. "I want you both to understand something," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his military background. "What happened today wasn't your fault. Derek Sullivan chose to target Jake, chose to escalate the situation, chose to endanger your brother's health. Maya, you responded appropriately to protect your family. I'm proud of both of you." Jake looked up from his untouched dinner. "But Dad, what if the police get involved? What if they try to arrest Maya?" "Then we'll deal with it," David replied, firmly. "We have video evidence, witness testimony, and the fact that Maya was protecting you from what amounts to medical abuse. Any reasonable person can see that she acted in defense of others." Maya appreciated her father's confidence, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to face challenges that went beyond what was reasonable or fair. The Sullivan family had money, influence, and connections throughout Riverside. They also had a reputation to protect and a son whose humiliation in front of his peers would demand some kind of retribution. As if summoned by her thoughts, the doorbell rang. David Morrison answered it to find two police officers standing on his front porch, their expressions serious but not hostile. Behind them, Maya could see a police cruiser parked in their driveway, its presence sure to be noted by every neighbor. On the street, "Mr. Morrison, I'm Officer Janet Collins, and this is Officer Mike Rodriguez. We'd like to speak with you about an incident that occurred at the high school today involving your daughter Maya." David invited the officers inside, maintaining the calm professionalism he'd learned during his years of military service. Maya and Jake joined them in the living room, both nervous but trying to appear cooperative and respectful. Officer Collins took the lead in questioning, her approach professional but thorough. She asked Maya to recount the events of the day, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. Maya's account remained consistent with what she had told Dr. Williams, and she was careful to emphasize that her actions were taken in response to a medical emergency. "Ms. Morrison," Officer Collins said when Maya finished her account, "I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You're saying that Derek Sullivan was withholding your brother's inhaler while Jake was having an asthma attack?" "Yes, ma'am. Derek had taken the inhaler from Jake and was refusing to give it back. Jake was in serious respiratory distress, and Derek seemed to think it was funny." Officer Rodriguez leaned forward. "And you felt that physical intervention was the only way to retrieve the medication?" "I asked Derek to give Jake the inhaler, and he refused," Maya replied. "Jake's condition was getting worse by the minute. I used the minimum force necessary to get the medication and help my brother." The officers reviewed the video evidence that had been provided by the school, watching the footage several times and noting the timeline of events. The video clearly supported Maya's version of the story, showing Derek's behavior and Jake's obvious distress. After nearly an hour of questioning, Officer Collins closed her notepad and looked directly at Maya. "Ms. Morrison, based on our investigation and the available evidence, we're not going to pursue criminal charges at this time. Your actions appear to have been taken in defense of your brother during a medical emergency." The relief in the room was palpable, but Officer Collins wasn't finished. "However, I want to make something clear. Physical force should always be a last resort. If you find yourself in a similar situation in the future, your first option should be to seek help from a teacher, administrator, or other adult authority figure." Maya nodded respectfully. "I understand, Officer Collins, but with all due respect, there wasn't time to find an adult. Jake needed his medication immediately." Officer Collins studied Maya for a moment, noting the calm maturity in her response. "I understand your position, and I'm not criticizing your actions given the circumstances. I'm just making sure you understand that this kind of intervention carries risks and should only be used when absolutely necessary." As the officers prepared to leave, Officer Rodriguez turned to David Morrison. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to know that we've also spoken with Derek Sullivan and his family. We've made it clear that interfering with someone's medical treatment, especially during an emergency, is a serious matter that could result in criminal charges if it happens again." After the police left, the Morrison family sat in their living room processing what had just happened. The immediate crisis was over, but Maya knew that the larger battle was just beginning. Derek Sullivan had been humiliated in front of his peers and disciplined by the school. His father had been thwarted in his attempt to have Maya arrested and expelled. Neither of them was likely to accept these defeats gracefully. Over the following days, the incident at Riverside High School continued to generate controversy throughout the community. The local newspaper picked up the story. running a carefully worded article that described the altercation without taking sides, but included quotes from Richard Sullivan about his concerns regarding violence in schools. Social media was less restrained. The video of Maya's intervention went viral within the local community, shared and reshared with commentary that ranged from admiring to outraged. Some people praised Maya for protecting her brother and standing up to a bully. Others condemned her for using violence and attacking a boy who, they claimed, was just trying to help. The divide seemed to fall along predictable lines. Families who had experienced bullying themselves tended to support Maya's actions. Parents of athletes and popular students, particularly those connected to the Sullivan family's business interests, tended to side with Derek. Teachers and school staff were largely silent publicly, but many privately expressed relief that someone had finally stood up to Derek's pattern of harassment. Maya returned to school after her one-day suspension to find the atmosphere completely changed. Students who had never noticed her before now stared as she walked through the hallways. Some approached her with expressions of admiration, telling her they were glad someone had finally put Derek in his place. Others maintained their distance, clearly afraid of being associated with someone who had challenged the school's power structure. Jake's experience was similarly complex. The boy, who had been invisible to most of his classmates, was now the center of attention, though not always in ways he appreciated. Some students treated him with new respect, recognizing him as someone who had survived Derek Sullivan's harassment campaign. Others seemed to view him as a troublemaker whose family had brought unwanted drama to the school. Derek's absence during his suspension created a power vacuum that other students were quick to fill. Marcus Thompson tried to maintain Derek's position as leader of their social group, but without Derek's charisma and family influence, Marcus found himself unable to command the same level of fear and respect. The most significant change was in the behavior of other potential victims. Students who had been quietly enduring harassment from Derek's group began to speak up, emboldened by Maya's example. Several reported incidents to administrators that they had previously kept to themselves. Others started walking taller, making eye contact, refusing to be intimidated by behavior they had once accepted as inevitable. Dr. Williams found herself dealing with a cascade of complaints and reports as students came forward with stories of bullying that had been going on for months or even years. The scope of Derek's harassment campaign became clear, revealing a pattern of behavior that went far beyond typical teenage social dynamics into what could only be described as systematic intimidation. The pressure on Dr. Williams intensified. As well, Richard Sullivan's threats proved to be more than empty bluster. The school board received formal complaints about her handling of the situation, demanding an investigation into her decision-making process. Local business leaders who depended on Sullivan's factory for their livelihoods began making subtle inquiries about Dr. Williams's fitness for her position. But Dr. Williams also received support from unexpected quarters. Teachers who had been afraid to speak up about Derek's behavior began sharing their own experiences and observations. Parents of other students who had been harassed reached out to express their gratitude for her decision to take the incident seriously. Educational advocacy groups praised her for prioritizing student safety over political considerations. The full disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, and everyone understood that it would be more than just a review of one incident. It would be a referendum on how Riverside High School dealt with bullying, on whether students like Jake Morrison deserved the same protection as students like Derek Sullivan, and on whether the school's policies would be shaped by educational best practices or political influence. As the weekend approached, Maya and Jake Morrison prepared for whatever came next. They had taken a stand that had already changed their lives and their school in ways they were still discovering. The question now was whether that change would be lasting or whether the forces aligned against them would find a way to restore the old order. Maya spent Saturday afternoon training with her father in their backyard, practicing the self-defense techniques that had served her so well during the confrontation with Derek. But the physical training was only part of the preparation. David Morrison was also teaching his daughter about mental resilience, about staying calm under pressure, about maintaining her principles even when the cost was high. The hardest part isn't the fight itself, David told Maya as they worked through defensive scenarios. The hardest part is everything that comes after. The doubt, the second guessing, the pressure to apologize for doing what you knew was right. You saved your brother's life, Maya. Don't let anyone convince you that you did anything wrong. As Sunday evening approached and the disciplinary hearing loomed, Maya Morrison looked back on the week that had changed everything. 7 days ago, she had been just another new student trying to blend in and avoid trouble. Now, she was at the center of a controversy that had divided her school and community, facing consequences that could affect her entire future. But looking at Jake, seeing him breathe easily and walk with more confidence than he'd shown in weeks, Maya knew she had made the right choice. Whatever happened at the hearing, whatever price she had to pay for protecting her brother, it would be worth it. Some things were more important than keeping the peace or avoiding conflict. Some things were worth fighting for, even when fighting meant shocking everyone around you and changing everything forever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Jake Morrison was safe, and his sister Maya had made sure of it. That was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.